Meu nome é Cássia Marques da Costa, eu sou gerente de desenvolvimento institucional da Rede de Ação Política pela Sustentabilidade, a RAPS. A RAPS é uma organização da sociedade civil apartidária e independente, que reúne políticos de diferentes ideologias e partidos, com a missão de contribuir para o aperfeiçoamento da democracia e a inserção da pauta da sustentabilidade na agenda política brasileira, né? Nosso trabalho é realizado desde 2012 e hoje nós temos uma rede que é composta por mais de 700 lideranças políticas, entre membros eleitos e não eleitos, e uma rede hoje de mais de 230 políticos eleitos com mandatos na esfera federal, municipal e estadual. O evento de hoje está sendo realizado em conjunto com a Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Eu aproveito a ocasião para agradecer mais uma vez ao Sérgio Fausto, né, diretor executivo da Fundação, por seguirmos juntos em mais uma oportunidade, né, como essa, numa discussão tão relevante, tão importante nesse momento. Quero agradecer também à professora Jennifer McCoy por aceitar o convite, pela disposição em dialogar conosco nesse momento, sobretudo neste momento em que estamos vivendo. O evento de hoje tem como título, né, Polarização política, como superá-la e promover o diálogo na sociedade, tendo em conta que o acirramento da polarização política e a desconfiança nas instituições tem instigado lideranças populistas, né, e vem promovendo enfraquecimento da cultura democrática e da capacidade da sociedade de lidar com conflitos políticos ao redor do mundo. Acho que o episódio da invasão do Capitólio levanta, né, uma pergunta e acende, né, um alerta mundial, que é como lidar com o acirramento da polarização e sair deste ciclo, né? Então, eu fico muito feliz que nós estejamos tendo a oportunidade de fazer essa discussão tão importante e tão necessária, mas ao mesmo tempo triste e ressentida por chegarmos nesse momento, enquanto sociedade, né, a um ponto de tanta intolerância, violência e segmentação. Sérgio, eu queria passar a palavra para você, para uma fala inicial, e depois, em seguida, apresentar a Jennifer, e em seguida queremos muito ouvir as considerações da professora Jennifer, que de forma certamente vai engrandecer aqui a nossa discussão e nos trazer insights importantes. Então, muito obrigada, Jennifer, obrigada, Sérgio, obrigada a todos que nos acompanham hoje, estão nos ouvindo aqui para essa discussão.
Cássia, fala rápida da minha parte, porque o objetivo aqui é termos o maior tempo possível para escutar a Jennifer e depois conversarmos com ela, recebendo as perguntas do público, que serão selecionadas e, na medida do possível, apresentadas a Jennifer, né? Me cabe aqui, além de retribuir com toda a sinceridade o agradecimento de vocês, né? É sempre um prazer fazer atividades em conjunto com a RAPS. Temos já um longo relacionamento institucional e eu, em particular, sou um admirador do trabalho que vocês fazem. Mas, além de retribuir este agradecimento, eu queria dizer duas palavras sobre quem é Jennifer McCoy. Jennifer, be sure I'm going to say wonderful things about you, but I'm going to say them in Portuguese, right? Jennifer McCoy tem uma característica que eu acho que a distingue, né? Porque, além dela ter todas as credenciais acadêmicas para discutir esse tema, o tema da polarização, e vem dedicando grande parte da sua vida acadêmica e intelectual nos últimos anos à análise deste fenômeno, que todos sabemos é um fenômeno global, buscando não apenas o diagnóstico, mas também apontar caminhos de superação da polarização perniciosa, e essa é uma distinção conceitual importante que ela faz. Mas, além de todo este trabalho, a Jennifer é o que, em inglês, eu nunca encontrei uma tradução realmente boa para a ideia do practitioner, né? Não é propriamente um ativista, mas é uma pessoa que devotou grande parte da sua vida e vem devotando à defesa da democracia em processos de exacerbação do conflito político, seja na mediação desses conflitos, seja buscando assegurar a lisura de processos eleitorais. e ela fez isso à frente do Carter Center de 1998 a 2015. Carter Center, criado pelo ex-presidente Carter, que é do estado da Geórgia, onde a Jennifer leciona na Universidade da Geórgia, universidade pela qual ela também tem o seu PhD. Depois eu vou querer saber se a Jennifer nasceu também na Geórgia, além de ter estudado na Geórgia e trabalhado na Geórgia. Então, a Jennifer tem uma visão global deste fenômeno, conhece a América Latina de perto, em particular a Venezuela, que é um caso extremado de polarização, conhece como acadêmica e conhece como quem atuou de fato, sentiu na pele esses processos e, portanto, tem muito a nos dizer e muito a conversar conosco, né? O Brasil vive esse processo. Para terminar, a Jennifer publicou um artigo muito interessante sobre esse mesmo tema no penúltimo número do Journal of Democracy, que é uma publicação não para acadêmicos, feitas por uma instituição americana. A Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso tem os direitos de publicação em português destes artigos e publicará no próximo número um artigo da professora Jennifer McCoy em coautoria com Murat Somer, que é uma pesquisadora turca, sobre o tema da polarização perniciosa e como superá-la. Então já fica a dica aqui, quem quiser ler, estará disponível no site da Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso, gratuitamente, este artigo da professora Jennifer. Já falei demais, queria pedir uma última licencinha para vocês, para mostrar as logomarcas das empresas que nos apoiam ao longo de todo o ano na programação de seminários da Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Queria agradecer muito a cada uma delas e a todas elas em conjunto. Jennifer, the floor is yours for about 15 to 20 minutes for your presentation. We are very glad that you have made the time to be here with us today. Go ahead, please.
All right. Thank you so much, Sergio and Cassia. It is really a pleasure to be here with all of you today and talking about this really difficult problem. I've actually lived this problem of pernicious polarization in two countries particularly, which is my own. In the United States, we've been living through a growing polarization since the mid-1990s, I would say. And I studied and worked as a mediator and democracy promotion person in Venezuela for 30 years. And so watched that country go through extreme change, deep, deep divisions, and eventually collapse of their democracy. So I really started this project from that experience. I wanted to talk about my concept of pernicious polarization. When we think of polarization, it's not necessarily bad for democracy. Polarization, if it's defined simply as difference or distance in political positions on issues or political preferences, that is positive because we want to see a difference. We want to offer to voters alternatives from political parties. So simply political polarization in terms of those kinds of differences is good and natural for democracy. What I'm talking about is when we see extremes of this, and it's really a process where politics becomes simplified and political leaders in particular try to present a binary choice. They try to simplify politics into an either or kind of choice. And so it's binary and it's us versus them. And usually the them is presented as an enemy. This is the really pernicious polarization with very harmful consequences for democracy. Because what happens in this case is that the normal polarization over differences in policy positions, preferences, attitudes that people have on different issues, becomes collapsed into two different political camps, and it becomes an identity. When your partisanship or your identification with a particular political leader or group becomes like a social identity, and when it becomes reinforced with other identities or groups that you belong to, which might be racial or ethnic, it might be religious, it might be where you live, if you're from the rural countryside or from the urban settings. It might be the north and the south part of the country. Sometimes we see divides. When these identities line up and they are consolidated into two different blocks of society and politics, that is when we see two immovable camps that distrust each other, dislike each other, and eventually come to fear each other. They eventually come to see each other as an existential threat to the nation or your way of life. That's the kind of polarization we're seeing growing in the country, in the world, in many countries around the world today, that I have been so concerned about and studying and looking to see, can we find solutions to this? Now we have to think about, how does it happen? It happens when there are normal grievances in a society. So people can be upset, particularly if there's a crisis, if there's been an economic crisis or a security crisis. People can have grievances, and they can be really exaggerated after these crises. Or there may be long-standing divisions in a society, grievances that might be over a racial discrimination. It might be over religious discrimination. And one group of the population may feel excluded from political power, from resources, from benefits. That doesn't, and even ethnic differences, countries with very different ethnic differences, say the Philippines, you might see a lot of differences. But that doesn't necessarily translate into this pernicious polarization until a political leader decides to make it so. And they can do that with their rhetoric, with their narrative, with their messages, where they speak in these terms and they identify who is the other and who is the them, who is different from us and who is threatening to us. That's what really causes it. And sometimes we see political leaders actually create the issue around which people will divide. So as an example, when Donald Trump began his campaign in 2016 in the United States, his very first speech when he announced that he would come out as a presidential candidate, he identified immigration and the threat from immigrants. And he used the terminology like Mexican immigrants who are rapists and murderers. Okay, he identified an enemy, and he put this issue of immigration high on the agenda. He brought it to the people's attention. Now, before this, Americans actually were not that divided on the immigration issue. There was a general consensus that immigrants can be positive for the country. And while we needed some border control, we needed to have some path for them to become legal residents. But he made it a divisive issue. So political entrepreneurs can actually create divisive issues, or they can build on existing grievances, existing divisions, and raise them up to the level of this pernicious polarization. So when this happens, we have this psychology of intergroup conflict kick in, and we have the groups become loyal and bonded to their own in-group. And they usually have exaggerated positive perceptions and sentiment about their own group. And the out-group, they have stereotypes, they have biases, misperceptions about. and they're generally negative, and they have the dislike and the distrust. When that happens, we begin to stop communicating, we stop interacting. We have many public opinion polls showing in countries like Turkey or the United States, people don't want to marry across the divide. They don't want to go into business with people across the divide. They don't want their children to play with children from the other side. And then people don't want their politicians, their political leaders, to compromise. They become opposed to compromise because they think that they're abandoning the principles, the values that are protecting their own way of life. When that happens, we have first a breakdown in governability. Governments can become paralyzed if there are two or more coalitions or blocks of political interests that nobody has, a dominant or hegemonic position. Then we have gridlock, paralysis, decisions don't get made. This happens in the United States repeatedly. Or if one party is able to dominate, or one political coalition, then we have a hegemonic party that very often follows the pattern of changing the laws, changing the rules, particularly the electoral rules, to entrench themselves in power. And we have a pattern of democratic erosion. Eventually, in some cases, we see this creeping authoritarianism lead finally to democratic collapse, which may be such as happened in Thailand when we had polarization between two camps, repeatedly the yellow shirts and the red shirts, eventually a military coup in 2014, ended democracy for 5 years. Or the creeping authoritarianism of Venezuela, leading eventually to a collapse, I would argue happened in 2016 in that country. Okay, so there are patterns about this. There are patterns of the way it happens and what we're seeing around the world. And I would say that there's a measure we can look at now that defines polarization the way I have, as when two hostile camps emerge in a society and politics, unwilling to compromise, almost unwilling to coexist. What we see is a measure in a think tank called Varieties of Democracy that has been measuring this in countries around the world over time. We can see that this polarization is rising in every region of the world in the last decade. So it's a worldwide phenomenon. Now it varies by country. Not every country is rising, but every region is rising. Europe on the Western side is the lowest, but Central and Eastern Europe, it is rising. But Europe overall as a region is the lowest, and all the other regions are above the world average and rising. We know it's a pattern. We also know from the research we've done that it is linked to, corresponds with rising polarization, corresponds with an erosion, a deterioration of the liberal democracy scores in a country. So we see this link and this worldwide pattern. Now, what can we do about it? What lessons have we learned? Well, we've learned several lessons by looking at this. And now I would tell you, overcoming it is very, very difficult once it's entrenched in a society, especially at the social level, when people are no longer, when families are divided, when neighborhoods are divided. But what we've learned are several things that can help us figure out how to deal with it. One is the first thing that I said, that political leaders can drive this polarization when they're exploiting some underlying grievances that people have. So political leaders drive it, they use it for their own political ambitions. Now, they may have political ambitions that are to transform a society for the good. They may think, they may articulate a positive transformation of the society. But if they use this strategy, it is going to end up with negative consequences. They also may be doing it just for their own personal ambition. And so it may not be, this positive, transformative goal, but for their own personal ambition, because most politicians come to realize a polarizing political strategy, particularly during elections, is a winning strategy. Now, the question is, can there be other winning strategies? But the first lesson is political leaders drive this, therefore, political leaders ought to be able to reduce it. And so I want to first put the challenge to everyone who is, thinking of or already is a political leader to consider how your own narrative can help to drive a pernicious position like this, or could help to reduce it. The second lesson, opposition parties play an important role. So you may have a political leader who is polarizing, an incumbent, but it really matters, what does the opposition do? What do the other political parties do? They can exacerbate it, make it worse, or they can contain it. Generally we see that political parties can have two general directions to go. They can have a goal that is what I would call a preservative goal, meaning they want to return to the status quo ante. They want to return to the way things were before this new group came to power, or this new leader brought in some other group and displaced the old group from power. So if the opposition is the old group that now feels displaced and they just want to return to their position of power, then that's a preservative goal. And usually what they will do, the pattern we've seen in country after country, is that they will reciprocate the polarizing strategy along the same cleavage, the same line, the same divide. They'll reciprocate it with the same kind of demonizing language, insulting the leader and their followers, talking about how terrible they are, how threatening they are in very insulting terms. That's reciprocating it. And that will simply entrench the logic into the political dynamics. Or they might just passively kind of appease it or mask it. So I would ask you to think about Chile after Pinochet's removal. And the Concertación came together. They had a major consensus on the economic strategy to continue a market-oriented economic strategy. So it was very positive to have this consensus because they didn't want to destabilize the country more. But what they actually did was mask the underlying polarization by failing to address the inequalities and the grievances that were underlying the original, rise of Allende and bringing in the military coup back in 1973. Until now, we've seen in the last 5 years or so in Chile, the protests coming over the economic inequality, the privatization of education, Social Security, and really becoming very strong over the last couple of years. So that simply suspended the polarization, that consensus among the parties. It just suspended it. It didn't address the underlying different grievances. So the second kind of goal that opposition parties can have are what I would call generative goals, to deepen democracy or to renew the social contract, looking forward. And here they could try it in two different ways. An active depolarization, which would be reestablish those, what political scientists call cross-cutting ties in a society, which means I belong to one particular church, but I also belong to an environmental group, and I also belong to, a sports team. I'm a fan of a sports team. I have these different identities, these different interests. And so I reach across people from different political parties and interests are in these different groups. Those are cross-cutting ties. In this polarization I'm talking about, we don't have that anymore. We are in the two camps. All of our social activity is only in my camp. my communication, my source of information, my social media, my news sources are all in one camp. Okay, we've got to change that. We've got to get back to the cross-cutting ties. So an active depolarization strategy would try to identify all these different interests that we have, what unites us as a society, as a country as well. And I would suggest that looking at the last US campaign, American campaign, Joe Biden was following this strategy, saying, let's unite, I will be a president for everybody, let's come together. That would be an active depolarization strategy. An alternative might be still generative, looking to generate something new for the future, would be what I would call transformative repolarization, where we change the axis of polarization, the dividing line. So it's no longer something like immigration or just I'm pro-Trump or anti-Trump. Now let's say, no, we've got to focus on a new line of value, an idea, which might be social justice. It might be racial equality, which is a big issue in the United States. It might just be democracy. And so, yes, there's an us versus them around ideas. We value racial equality. We reject racism, but it's got to be done in a way that is not insulting the identity of other people. You're not demonizing, not falling into that trap. So I'm just going to say quickly a few other things to think about, and we can talk further about how to overcome this kind of polarization. Because so opposition parties, political leaders, the strategies they take are absolutely critical, but also institutions. Institutions are very important. And in this polarization, institutions themselves change. They change because people's perceptions about them change. They become politicized. And so let's say an accountability institution such as impeachment. So when a Congress or a parliament tries to impeach a president, that should be a mechanism for oversight. We've seen in Brazil, it became very political with Dilma's impeachment. The United States, the attempts to impeach Donald Trump became very political, so that one side of the divide sees the whole exercise as illegitimate from the very beginning. They don't want to look at any evidence or anything. It's just illegitimate. They believe it's driven by political ambition to remove my president. And the other side is trying to do it as a political oversight mechanism. So we lose our ability to have agreed upon conflict resolution mechanisms. And there are some institutional changes that we can also make to change the situation that can reduce the stakes of the elections, or that could help to change the logic of this. We could talk more about those. And then thinking about what if you're actually able to remove a polarizing leader, what next? Because what we know is simply removing the top, removing one person, you defeat them in an election, you impeach them, you get rid of them some way. Well, that's not enough. That is not enough. So what we've got to do, I would suggest, would be consider three things. A new government comes in. First, shift the narrative from identities to ideas. Avoid vengeance. Do not use discrediting or delegitimizing language about your opponents. Consider your opponents as legitimate opponents. Don't try to disintegrate them as traitors to the country. Second would be performance. Try to begin to address those underlying grievances that led to the polarization and in the first place. Must address those. Third, institutional reforms to try to reduce any winner-take-all institutions in the country and lower the stakes of the elections. Because when people feel this mutual threat from the other side taking power, if they feel like it's not so threatening if the other side takes power, that we'll still have a say, we'll still have some participation in some way, then they won't be so inclined to support the anti-democratic behavior of their own politicians in order to keep out the other people. And the last thing I will offer is agency is important, which means our own voluntary decisions. What individuals do matters. So at the level of political leaders, for any of you all who are, running or are going to be leaders, avoid the trap of being pushed into one camp or another. Because in polarization, each side wants to label everyone. If you're not with us, then you're against us. But in polarization, we need bridge builders. We need people who are courageous enough to withstand those attacks, because you will be called a traitor or a sellout. And it takes a lot of courage to be a bridge builder in a polarized situation. And then at the level of citizens, citizens have got to learn to recognize the early signs, the warning signs of this polarization, and be willing to talk with people who think differently. Be curious, try to understand what's underlying their positions. What are their motivations? What are their values? You may find something actually of common ground that you value, that you could work together to try to find solutions. All right, I'll stop there and move on to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for your clear, to the point, and appealing presentation. Cássia, you have the right of the first question. Would you like to ask it?
Yes, Sergio, thank you. Actually, I have two questions, Jennifer, and I'll address them together. One of them is from Eduardo Oliveira, and he's asking what is the difference between the concept of perception polarization and the concept of populism and its ideational aspect. And the other question is from Lillian, and she's wondering, what are the indicators to measure the polarization in a country? Are they the same to measure the level of democracy? So these are the two. We can start by them. I don't know if Sergio has more questions to address.
No, I think I do have more questions, but I think these two first questions are,
we can start with them.
Enough, for the time.
Okay. The first question, did you say the difference between the perception of polarization and populism?
The pernicious polarization and populism.
And populism, yeah. What I would say is, I'm going to give you my definition of populism, but what I would first say is populists are always polarizing, but not all polarizers are populists. Okay, so populism to me is a style of politics that tries where the politician or the person who considers themselves populist, has populist attitudes, are very anti-elite, anti-establishment, but pro-people. So they believe that the people should have the say in a democracy. Okay, so far that sounds very democratic. That's a democracy. But what populists do is they privilege the pro-people side of democracy. So the definition of democracy that is popular sovereignty, that is, the majority should win and the majority should decide. But in my definition of democracy, I also include a liberal side. So when I talk about democracy, I actually mean liberal democracy. The liberal part of it is the protection of individual rights And it argues that there is a role for the political minority. Okay, so in liberal democracy, there are also forms of checks and balances so that we can have accountability. That is, even if we want a very strong president to make decisions, to have an efficient government, we don't want an all-powerful government because that would be a dictatorship or a monarchy. So there needs to be a division of powers and oversight of the different powers. And that's why, in the Western Hemisphere, all throughout the Western Hemisphere, we primarily have presidential democracies, but with Congress and with the courts, judiciary, and they each have checks and balances over each other. So populists say that they are representing the will of the people. Now, the problem with that is, who are the people? And a populist leader will decide who are the people that he or she thinks that, claims to be representing. So populism generally is not a negative or a positive thing. But what I've seen is that it can be very positive in the sense it's bringing in the voice of people who may have been marginalized and unrepresented. So that's very positive. But what we've seen around the world is that most of the patterns of populism can be very dangerous because there's another part of it. There's two other parts of populism. And that is what we call the Manichaean philosophy, which is saying that there's a moral divide here. There's a moral judgment. And this anti-elite part saying, we're against usually it's the political establishment. The elite might be the economic elite. It might be, for example, in Europe, the elite is often the European Union Commission, the technocrats making decisions. But so the elite can vary who they are. But if we're saying that they are, the populist will often say they are nefarious. They are only out for their own interests against the interest of the people. But the people are always good and positive and virtuous. The problem again is who defines the people. And if the people are defined, such as in Hungary, the leader of Hungary defines Hungarians as only the Christians, so no Muslims or other religions, and only Hungarian speaking, Hungarian natives, even if they live outside the country. Those are the Hungarian people. And so it's a question of who are you excluding when you define who the people are. And then the second negative part of a populist is when they're saying that I am the representative of the true people of this country, then naturally I have to be elected because I represent the majority. So a populist will claim to be the exclusive representative of the true people. And therefore, they will often claim that if they're going to, if there's any threat to their reelection, it will be because there's a fraud, not because they lost the popular support, because they can't lose the popular support because they're representing the true people who are the majority. So that's the danger of populism. Now, what I said was they're always polarizing because they have this us versus them, the elite versus the people divide. And they create often these consequences of the characteristics of pernicious polarization that I described. And sometimes they create it simply because by bringing in a population that was not represented before. For example, in Bolivia, when Evo Morales was first elected in 2006, and he's representing the indigenous for the first time as president, there's a backlash. And the former elite will often choose one of those reciprocal polarizing strategies and create a huge conflict. with a backlash. That's where it's a two-way street. It's not just the populace, it is the prior elite, the backlash, if they're trying to then remove the populist or to secede from the country as they threatened in Bolivia, then you've got a major conflict. But polarizers don't necessarily have to be populist. You can be polarizing around other themes than simply elite versus people. But generally, we end up seeing these characteristics. Okay, sorry, that was just the first question.
There's the second question.
There's a second question. Yeah, sorry. Okay, I'll be quicker. Indicators of polarization. Yeah, there are signs of polarization when political parties stop being willing to compromise, when one political party simply says, we're going to be obstructionist to stop the other party from getting gains when they're in power. I would say this happened in the United States, first under Barack Obama and now with Joe Biden. And the Republican Party is, for the most part, just saying no to everything. We're going to obstruct everything rather than try to negotiate and compromise. That's a bad sign. But there are the measures that we can look at would be also, for example, in this think tank that I mentioned, the Varieties of Democracy think tank, they have one measure called political polarization. They ask experts to answer questions about societies. And one of the questions, this one is, to what extent is a country divided into two hostile political camps? They ask some other questions that we can look at as well, that has to do with willingness to compromise or respecting counter arguments. To what extent do political parties respect counter arguments from others, or do they simply discredit them as being illegitimate or unpatriotic? So that would be another sign of this pernicious polarization. And when people, when disinformation grows and people are refusing to accept messages of authorities, when they refuse to accept the legitimacy of someone in government or in the opposition, including their messages, and when they start to question even experts, when they question information, when a society can no longer agree on basic information or facts, these are all signs that you're really in a high state of polarization, which means that even news media, information, science, everything, the institutions can be politicized.
Jennifer, you've said and you've written that polarization is a political choice, right? But I think we have to reckon to the fact that there are some structural conditions, so to speak, which are conducive to polarization. I would like to comment on different factors of taking in the light of the U.S., right, which is I think is a very special case because of its irradiating power throughout the world. Demographic change is one thing. Economic dislocation is second factor, and social media, right? Is the dissemination of social media in itself a driver of polarization or not? I would like to hear your comments on that question.
The first two things you mentioned, I would say would be the sources, the underlying grievances. Demographic change, economic dislocation are two great examples of the underlying grievances that can drive polarization in this and make a society receptive to this, the top down, coming from the narrative of political leaders. Demographic change has been one of the key drivers in the United States, I believe, because it is threatening the loss of group status, meaning the loss of status, which can be not only economic wealth, but simply social status of the groups that had been, for the history of the United States, the accepted dominant group. which is primarily white male Christians. Okay, that is the group that has been dominant in all spheres of American life for 200 years. And it has been threatened with demographic change over the last 50 years of women entering the workplace, of religious diversity, and especially of racial and ethnic diversity, such that we now know from the last census that whites will no longer be the majority of the population within about 10 to 15 years, as other demographics, Latinos, Asians, and African Americans are all growing. So that's a driver. Social media definitely exacerbates, but when we look over history, we see that every technological change, particularly with information, can lead to polarization. So now we have our most recent technological change with social media, which makes it worse because it drives everything faster and on a larger scale. So that, yes, you can send out very negative messages, polarizing messages, and disinformation and reach people to a scale we've never heard of. But if you go all the way back to the printing press, and you realize that Martin Luther could print his tracts for the Reformation that created the divide between Protestants and Catholics. That goes back to the printing press. And radio, when radio came in, you could see divides there. In Rwanda, radio was actually what was used to create the divide, Hutus and the other ethnic group.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I always forget the
yeah, Tutsis
yeah.
And the Tutsis.
The Tutsis, yeah.
Hutus and the Tutsis. Adolf Hitler and others, the fascists using the radio during the interwar years. So every technological communication device has been used for polarizing purposes. But one other structural thing I want to mention, certainly the way institutions are set up, the electoral system can either make polarization much more likely or not. And also the political party system. So Brazil is very interesting because you haven't really had polarization at the political party level because of the way you're set up. But an electoral system can make it worse. And one of the worst is a majoritarian system. On single member districts rather than proportional representation. So I prefer proportional representation to avoid polarization. But it's not a guarantee, because even with a parliamentary system and proportional representation with multiple parties, you can still divide into two coalitions. And you can still be divided by a single political leader, whether you're either for or against that political leader. So it's not a guarantee, but majoritarian electoral systems tend to be the worst because they do raise the stakes of the election, and it is winner take all. And it creates a better chance of disproportionate representation so that one political party can win, say, 48% of the popular vote and get 2/3 in the legislature and change the Constitution on their own.
Can I ask one more question about the US, and then you go on, Kasia? I would like to hear your take about the strategy adopted by President Biden. You said that at least in the electoral campaign, his strategy was one of a sort of more conventional depolarizing strategy. But I think now, after his administration was inaugurated, clearly he is trying to adopt a more, let me quote you. You said a transformative repolarization of the country. Do you think he will succeed? I'm really impressed about the way Trump has captured the GOP, right? How daring they are in their strategy at the state level to defranchise Blacks and Latinos from their voting rights. So what is your take on how things will play out in the US regarding this Biden strategy to transformative to depolarize the country or to repolarize it in new terms?
I think what Biden did, first, I would say we have asymmetric polarization in the United States at the level of the political parties. At the level of the society, it's symmetrical. Democrats and Republicans hate and distrust each other equally. At the level of the political parties, I mentioned before, going back to the beginning of Obama, and Joe Biden was his vice president, they had the goal, the stated goal of rising above politics. Remember, Obama wanted to be purple. So bringing together blue and red to become purple. He wanted to rise above the polarization. And he found very fast that he couldn't, because the Republicans refused to work with him, refused to cooperate on negotiating even the response to the 2008 financial crisis that hit the world. The Democrats had to do that on their own. So Biden didn't learn from that, or even when he started this campaign after we then went through Trump, he thought he could try that again, I think, being the depolarizer. And he won the campaign, the primaries in the Democratic Party against the repolarizers, which would be Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who wanted to try this generative, let's have a new social contract, and fight inequality, et cetera. Biden took the other strategy. But again, he came in, he couldn't get cooperation from the Republicans. Plus, he's being pushed by the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which was vital for his election. I mean, he can't operate without them. So he's being pushed by them as well. And you're right, he's moving more towards that transformative repolarization because his proposals, particularly the spending on the family, what he's calling not only the physical infrastructure, but the human infrastructure of the country, really is transformative for this country, to really spend so much proposed money on transforming, the workplace, families, daycare, the environmental, all the environmental stuff, broadband, making it accessible to everybody, so many things, that it is transformative. And he is moving to do that. Unfortunately, I think what we're seeing now, there's a crisis right now, the cliff of, are we going to go into default as a country? The Republicans are digging in again, and they know they have the leverage to simply obstruct and force Democrats to solve this on their own, so that then the Republicans can attack them in the next elections for raising the debt on their own. That's the strategy that we're watching in these 2 weeks. And the Republicans are not going to give in for the big spending, the transformative spending. He will fail at that unless unless Biden wants to support removing a long-standing norm, which is the filibuster. And the United States is complicated because we have this thing, but what it essentially means is the filibuster required bipartisan consensus to pass anything at all. You have to get 60 votes to even say we're going to allow a vote on this piece of legislation. Removing it is a risky thing in a polarization, because if the Democrats remove that, they learned this already, removing it for justices, the election, the nomination of justices to the Supreme Court and to every level of judges. The Democrats did that, the Republicans took it to another level, and now either party can name judges without the consent of the minority party. If we move that to legislation, which is what's going to have to be required for Biden to achieve this transformative repolarization, this transformative agenda, that means that when the Republicans come back into power, which may be even next year in the Senate, if they get the majority in the Senate, they'll be able to pass any legislation they want without the Democrats doing anything. So it's risky. That's a tit for what I call the tit for tat strategy of polarization. But it's also the only way he's going to be able to move forward. So I don't know if he's going to back it or not, but I don't think he'll move forward without it, without getting rid of that.
I'll move to Portuguese. Ok. Jennifer, nós temos aqui um conjunto de perguntas muito relacionadas também ao caso brasileiro, então eu estou tentando selecionar aqui um pouquinho só por conta do nosso tempo, mas muitas das questões, né, vêm no sentido de por onde começar, né, como conseguimos educar o eleitorado para escapar às armadilhas, né, sobretudo em tempos de crise. Perguntas também relacionadas ao papel das cortes constitucionais, né, nesse processo, nesse jogo de polarização. Eu vou tentar concentrar nessas duas grandes questões, acho que é um pouco nessa tentativa de receber dicas e conselhos aí para o caso brasileiro. Se você puder fazer um comentário a respeito do papel do judiciário, aproveitando o seu último comentário aí sobre o caso americano, tá? Então, nós temos várias outras aqui, peço desculpas até a quem nos assiste pela impossibilidade de endereçar todas.
One specific question about how do you see political dynamics in Brazil? And are we in what stage of polarization? Are we deepening it? Are we softening it? Do we have a way out?
Yeah, I think Brazil is really interesting because, as I said before, it hasn't really been polarized in part because of your party system and the way the political system is working and the legislature. And this is another one of these institutional things in that for example, your party representatives, your legislators can switch parties so easily. And there's been, as I understand it, okay, I'm just giving you my perception from outside it. I could be wrong,
right.
But traditionally, the president has had to almost bribe, or convince with something, joining the cabinet, getting the ability to hand out jobs, or with, money or support for legislation, had to bribe in that sense. I don't mean necessarily corruption, but sometimes, yes, corruption for party legislators to join them to pass any legislation. And because you've had a multi-party system, so you haven't had really a party that has historically always gotten a majority or a very large majority. They could operate on their own. They have to work in coalition. And that has prevented this kind of polarization. Plus, as I understand it, and I'm be very curious to hear your opinion, Sergio and Cassia, on this, but that historically Brazilians have not been that tied to their political party, that political identity has not been, party identity has not been that strong. Now, it may have gotten stronger, and I think that we will especially see it next election if Lula is allowed to win. So you'll have clearly two camps that feel strongly tied to their leaders, with Bolsonaro and Lula. I would expect that to be a very polarizing situation if that comes about. But the question is, how strongly do people identify either with a leader or with a political party identity? The stronger people identify that way, and it becomes important to themselves, then the worse, or the higher the risk of this extreme polarization. If the people don't identify that, don't fall into that, then you probably won't risk the same level that we've seen in the United States and other countries. So that's kind of my question for you all, is where you think you are in that. To me, President Bolsonaro has been polarizing, and it kind of depends on what the opposition does. Now, in other countries, out of it, what do you do? What are the role of courts? What else do you do? When you get to the point that there is one political party or one leader that is so dominant, either with popularity or they've gained, up to 2/3 vote in the legislature so they can do whatever they want, then you must have a united opposition. There is no other way to combat that. And that's very, very difficult. We've seen Venezuela has tried, they've tried for 20 years, uniting against first Chavez and then Maduro. We've seen the same thing in Turkey and Hungary, other countries that have multi-party systems. And so it's difficult because then you're uniting from across the board, from left to right. And there's so much disagreement within an opposition in that situation that it's extremely difficult for them to come up with a positive message to offer voters. All they have is, I'm against Chavez, I'm against Erdogan. We as a coalition are against him, but okay, what are we for? They can't offer anything because there's too much disagreement or too much rivalry within it. That's the dilemmas that oppositions have when they have to unite against a very strong, polarizing incumbent. I don't know that Bolsonaro is that strong yet, that you're going to see that same dynamic, but those are the things to consider. The role of courts, the issue becomes, and I know that the courts have been playing a very important position. I do want to say the one thing I'm most alarmed about in Brazil is seeing the accusations coming out from the presidency about the potential election fraud or the, delegitimizing the election machines and the system. As I said before, this is something that populist leaders do as a very common pattern. If they think they can't win the election, they will lay the basis ahead of time for fraud, to cry fraud and delegitimize the process. Now, for them, it's risky because if they demotivate their own supporters, if their own supporters don't believe in the electoral process, they won't come out to vote. And Trump ran into that this past year after his election when he questioned it all. We had the runoff in my state of Georgia to elect the last two senators that gave the Democrats the majority in the Senate. Well, that was partly because his supporters were so convinced not to trust the system that some of them didn't vote. So it's risky, but raising that, and I understand that your courts are following a process about this. And so this is an important role if the courts are perceived as impartial, as independent. If the courts, whether it's the Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court, or lower level courts, if they become perceived by at least one sector of the population as not independent, then they can't play that important oversight or corrective role. And so that's the question, is what is the perception of the population about the courts? But otherwise, they play a very important role. In the United States, they played a very important role in curtailing some of Donald Trump's more outrageous attempts to carry out policies.
Cassia, there is a very interesting question from the ex-minister of justice and an important politician here in Brazil, Nelson Jobim, which regards the risks of violence in scenarios of extreme polarization. What are the signs we should pay attention to guard against the risk of violence? Based on your experience in Venezuela, for instance, or even in other countries of the world?
It's very high for a couple of reasons. The risks of violence, first, when people feel threatened, as they do in a polarized situation, either their loss of status, as I said, or they feel threatened because they believe the other side, if they gain power or if they stay in power, are going to devalue their way of life or the interest of the nation or the interest of their group. And when those threats become very high, then people are often willing to tolerate violations of democratic norms. Now, when do they get to the point they would actually be willing to carry out violence? We've seen polls in the United States showing that 15 to 20% of people can envision scenarios when violence would be justified, such as election results that they believe are false. And 15 to 20% is a lot of people that believe violence could be justified. That's pretty scary that we see that. The other scenario under polarization where I have seen violence happen, and this has been in Venezuela and as well as in the United States, is when the political leader, with the language of identifying individuals, sometimes by name, as the enemy, they are giving, or it could be a group of people, you know, Jewish people, Muslim people, whatever it is. If they identify them as, you know, threatening, the enemy, evil in some way, that gives a green light to their supporters to potentially carry out violent acts. And we've seen that happen. I've seen it happen in Venezuela. I've seen it happen in the United States.
I would like to comment on our situation nowadays, because this feeling of and afraid of violence was very present here on a couple of weeks ago when we had the celebrations of our Independence Day on September 7th. And there were huge crowds on the streets in supporting the president, Bolsonaro. And a lot of people were afraid about the risk of violence. It didn't happen, but this is something that is present. And I think this is a discussion that is already started, thinking on the elections next year, because we're going to have presidential elections. And this feeling of the risk of violence in elections next year is something that is already here. That's a comment. And I would like to just, I'm trying to see the other questions here, but Cedric, if you have something to add, please.
To piggyback on this question, I think we are approaching the very end of our, because we had an agreement with Jennifer that we will be closing at 6:15, right? So we still have 5 minutes left. I would like to know your opinion about freedom of expression in light of the present situation, right? In the U.S., there is the well-known doctrine of present and clear danger, right? The Supreme Court in Brazil has taken action in order to curb people who have been threatening the Supreme Court itself, the opposition, and there's a whole discussion here whether this is an infringement on the right of freedom of expression or not. What is your opinion in this regard, Jennifer? And I think you're pretty much your final remarks.
Okay. And I do want to answer one question I could see in English, which is, what is the role of youth? Because I think that's a really important one. I'm going to include that in my final answer. Freedom of expression, you know, the United States is probably on the extreme of supporting freedom of expression. Other countries, Canada, countries in Europe, Germany. Have Germany, they have more regulation of speech, of free speech, to not incite violence, to not refer to Nazism and stuff like that. Even in the United States, where we have this kind of extreme protection of free speech, there are limits, and certainly inciting violence is not acceptable. Inciting harm to other people is not accepted. Hate speech can be regulated, under some circumstances as well, but generally we allow a lot, but not inciting violence. We don't allow it here. And it becomes extremely complicated now, getting back to your social media question, with the platforms, Twitter and Facebook and everybody, and what they should be allowed as private sector, as private corporations, to decide on free speech. This has been one of the big debates in the United States. Should they have the right to decide what is free speech, what is threatening, what is harmful, what is not? So far, they've been taking a very lax view and allowing, in my view, too much threatening, because the disinformation that we have seen about our elections, about public health, and about groups in the society is harmful to democracy. It's harmful to the society. It causes death. So, the disinformation that has been allowed, I think, is way too much. But it's a big debate over how much should they be regulated? And this is a problem. And they've been trying to regulate, and particularly when they try to regulate political actors in their speech, it becomes extremely controversial. I want to close, though, by answering this question about the role of youth, because I think it's really what gives me hope for the future, because I imagine this is similar in Brazil. In the United States, the younger generations are more tolerant. They're more tolerant of differences, of different kinds of people, of differences of opinion, of differences of religion. But at the same time, they're more concerned about the existential threats to our world, which particularly is climate and the existential threats, because it is their future. And if, it's the older generations, it's my generation, it's Sergio's generation, that have not only caused the problems, but are refusing to listen. And it's the future of the young people that is at stake. And so it gives me hope that here, and I hope in Brazil, they are active politically. Here in the United States, they're much more active than they have been. They're running for office. We're getting elected people. And that's the only thing I just hope that they can do it and take power soon enough to save the world, because we are in an existential crisis. So sorry, that's both a hopeful and a dire closing, but that's how I feel.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jennifer. It's been wonderful to be here, to share the screen with you, to listen to what you have to say. And I think it was a learning experience for all of us. I hope you have enjoyed it also.
Thank you so much.
Would you like to say a few words, closing?
Yes, Sérgio. Jennifer, muito obrigada pela sua disposição, estar com a gente. Foi uma excelente conversa. Mesmo que não tenhamos tido a oportunidade de endereçar todas as perguntas, foi uma riquíssima discussão, então te agradeço mais uma vez por estar conosco. Eu acho que a RAPS tem cumprido parte do papel que você destacou aqui, e o nosso esforço ao longo desses últimos anos tem sido todo direcionado na promoção do diálogo entre as diferenças. Nós temos membros, como disse a você, de diferentes espectros político-ideológicos, e o nosso papel enquanto organização é permitir que haja um espaço seguro para a discussão, em que a diferença seja ouvida, seja tolerada e seja respeitada. Então, acho que esse é um avanço que conseguimos fazer. E com relação à pauta da agenda do clima, é também a nossa esperança, e é por meio dessa temática que nós temos trabalhado também com as lideranças políticas brasileiras e o grupo que está conosco hoje, para que, assumindo os seus mandatos e as suas atividades políticas, possam empreender ações aí para reverter ou endereçar aí os danos que já temos vivido. Então, coloco a RAPS à sua disposição para o que precisar. E, mais uma vez, muito obrigada, Sérgio, pela parceria, pelo espaço, e seguimos juntos aí nas próximas. Obrigada a todos e todas que nos assistiram, nos acompanharam, e poderão rever aqui essa excelente conversa no futuro. Muito obrigada, gente.
I would love to, and I do hope that the people in the audience who are, as I understand it, there are people who are activists working in, I don't know, grassroots organizations as well as political organizations, and this is the most fundamentally important thing, is to be active and to really participate and and be in charge of the change in your country. So I'm very happy, and thank you to RAP and to the Cardoso Foundation for organizing this and giving me this opportunity. But I'm very excited about your future, and excited to see what happens with Brazil.
Our pleasure. Jennifer, take care. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Sergio.